free to turn on your camera. It's always more fun to see faces, and that'll give me a sense of kind of who's here in the room. And as folks are continuing to introduce themselves and arrive in this space, just wanted to take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about myself and Feedback Labs. So my name is Alexis Banks. I lead our learning programs here at Feedback Labs, where our mission is to make feedback the norm and aid philanthropy, nonprofits, and government. We do that by offering presentations like this one and by building a community of feedback practitioners through our membership and regular convenings, like our annual summit and our bi-weekly collaborative problem-solving sessions called Lab Storms. And we work with others in the sector to create incentives to listen to the people at the heart of our work. So really prioritizing the voices of those with lived experiences, those that are proximate to the issues that we're working to address. So we have a packed agenda for our brief learning lab today. During today's session, we're going to talk about how we think about shifting power at Feedback Labs. So I'm going to share a spectrum of participation that you may have seen before and tell you a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about what we mean by feedback, and often in international development spaces in particular, I get questions about feedback versus evaluation. So we'll talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between feedback and M&E. And then I'm going to tell you the rationale for feedback, why we think it's worthwhile to prioritize in your work. And then I'm going to share with you the feedback loop methodology that we use here at Feedback Labs as a tool that you can use in your work, whether that's in programs, projects, organizational operations, to strengthen your feedback processes. And throughout all of this, I want you to be reflecting on how this is similar to or different from what you're currently doing to collect, analyze, and respond to feedback at your organizations. And we're going to give you some time at the end of today's session to really evaluate your own feedback strengths and opportunities for growth. So we'll have some polls throughout and then some polls at the end. And then, of course, happy to take some time towards the end of the session to answer your questions about feedback that may have come up throughout the Learning Lab. So that's a look at what we're going to cover today, and excited to see more and more folks arriving and introducing themselves in the chat. Hi, everyone. Great to see you, and thanks for introducing yourselves. Okay, so I mentioned I just wanted to start off with a little bit of kind of a framework for how we think about shifting power. This is a spectrum of participation that you may have seen in the past. It was originally created by the International Association for Public Participation, and it has since been adapted by the Collective Impact Forum and Tamarack Institute. And you can see over here on the left-hand side, they have inform. So informing communities about kind of what's taking place, what activities are going to be being carried out. And then on the far right, we have co-lead. So that's really inviting communities, constituents, program participants, or clients into co-leadership positions. And then in between, we have other forms of participation. So consultation, involvement, or collaboration. And so both, I think this is a spectrum that we can be kind of moving along. As we think about how to engage communities, how to shift power, we want to kind of move along this spectrum from informing communities of our plans to inviting them to co-lead in a program design or implementation, for example. But it's also a way to evaluate where are we currently. And we would make the case that Feedback Labs, that feedback can be used at any point throughout this spectrum. And many of the examples that are given here, like forming a working group or advisory body within a program, for example, for members of communities or constituents, clients to advise an organization, that is in itself a feedback mechanism. Carrying out feedback processes might be something that you do during a consultation in order to inform the design of a program, for example. And so this is one framework that you might use to think about how are we shifting decision-making power? How are we ultimately kind of making that shift to hand over and cede more power or share power with our constituents. So I wanted to kick off this conversation by sharing this spectrum. But for the most part, what we're going to be talking about today is feedback. And that is, I want to take a moment, kind of first things first, to define what we mean by feedback at Feedback Labs. So when we talk about feedback, we're referring to the thoughts, feelings, and perceptions from the people at the heart of our work about our products or services and their impact. Feedback should be used to influence related activities in the future. And when designed well, feedback can be used to foster equity in our work. And we believe that high quality feedback is made up of a closed feedback loop, which we can see on the screen here. We're going to dive a little bit more into the closed feedback loop throughout today's session. I mentioned before that whenever I talk about feedback in international development spaces, I often get asked about the differences and overlap between monitoring and evaluation and feedback. And so just wanted to pause here to highlight both some of the overlap and then some of the distinctions between the two. So in monitoring and evaluation, we're collecting and analyzing information about people's quality of life. We're looking at program outputs and outcomes, such as whether individuals have access to clean water, their level of reading proficiency or employment status. It can be collected from many sources. Feedback, on the other hand, always comes from constituents, and it includes their thoughts, feelings, and perceptions about their quality of life, or of the services that have been provided with the goal of improving the quality of life. So we might ask questions like, how satisfied are you with your access to clean drinking water? Or the services provided by your local water utility, or what ideas they have for how to improve their access to quality drinking water provided by a local utility. We might also ask how satisfied they are with their employment, to what extent a program played a role in helping them secure employment, or to what extent their needs are being met by their salary and benefits, for example. And high quality feedback processes also ask for constituents' recommendations for how to implement or improve a program. So we are also taking through a feedback process what we've learned in our initial collection phase. We often take it back to constituents for a dialogue where we have the opportunity to clarify and verify our understanding, to ask probing questions, to dig deeper, to get specific. And in an ideal feedback process, results are reported back to constituents. On the other hand, while M&E results can be shared externally, they're typically used internally to understand impact. And then lastly, when done well, both monitoring and evaluation and feedback are carried out continuously throughout a program and used to inform adaptation. So just wanted to highlight, again, what we see are similarities and then also differences between feedback and M&E. As I often know, a lot of folks in these spaces are coming from that M&E background. And thanks, Julie, for highlighting. If you do have questions for me throughout, feel free to throw those in the chat. There will be some designated opportunities for me to answer those questions, or we can also take some time at the end to make sure we tackle any questions you have to share. Okay, so far it's been a lot of me talking, and I'm really eager to hear from you all about your organization's experience with feedback. And so I'm going to share a link in the chat box. Let's see. And thank you, Julie, as well. And would invite you to take a moment to head to that website. That's polev.com/FBL524. And take a moment to answer this question. How would you describe your organization's feedback practices? For example, we don't know what you mean by feedback. We like the idea of good feedback practice, but haven't started yet. We think we do a good job, but it's not systematic. Or we do a good job collecting feedback, but we don't do much with it after. Or we do a great job collecting feedback and we close the loop every time. And for those who are indicating other, please feel free to share in the chat box what other means to you. Tell me how you would define your feedback practice at your organization. So right now, it looks like many folks are sharing, we think we do a good job, but it's not systematic. That's awesome to hear. And today, as I'm talking about this closed feedback loop, I think that'll be a great opportunity to kind of assess your current feedback practice. In addition, the loop itself is meant to be cyclical. So it's meant to be something that once we wrap up one feedback process, we're getting ready to launch another, and can be one way that you can embed a systematic feedback process into your organization. And then it looks like we've got several folks who are saying, we like the idea of good feedback practice, but haven't started yet. No problem, you're in the right place. I would say today's session is really an introduction to feedback and getting started with your feedback practice. And then I also see several folks say we do a good job collecting feedback, but we don't do much with it after. I think that's one of the values of this feedback loop methodology. It really places a big emphasis on what we call course correction. So making sure to act in response to the feedback that we receive and taking the critical step to report back to constituents about the result of the feedback process. And let's see what we've got in the chat. Okay, great. Wondering if some folks, it sounds like maybe some folks are asking about the slides, which we're happy to share after. Great, well, thanks everyone for taking a moment to reflect on what your feedback practice looks like coming into this conversation. And so excited to hear that for many of you, you have already kind of embarked on a feedback journey. You're already beginning to implement feedback in your work in one way or another. But for some, you might be finding that it's challenging to prioritize feedback in your work. And so based on that, we often like to share a little bit about the rationale for feedback, or why we think it's a good use of staff time and resources. What evidence tells us is that feedback can be used to first identify the most effective solutions to the needs of the people at the heart of your work, and strengthen outcomes. So we have some great examples of how feedback actually is directly related to improved programmatic outcomes. We also know that feedback can be used to save valuable time and money, that it can either help you target programming towards participants whose needs aren't being met. It can save you from going down a path to design a program that constituents don't want or need, for example, or that might result in low participation. It can also help you identify whose needs aren't being met and emphasize equity. And when we refer to equity, we're talking about striving intentionally to provide everyone what they need to succeed in a given environment or context, regardless of their social identities. So this includes eliminating barriers that have prevented full participation of marginalized groups. Okay, so we're going to look at an example of each of these three arguments in practice. The first is better outcomes. So as I mentioned, feedback helps you achieve better results and it can help you improve programmatic outcomes. So for example, by incorporating community feedback into the evaluation of schools in Uganda, this program was able to reduce teacher absenteeism by 13.2%, and student test scores improved from the 50th to the 58th percentile. So an example here of how feedback being used in an education setting in Uganda was able to reduce teacher absenteeism and improve student test scores. On the other hand, this example from the US demonstrates how feedback can be used to target programming to save valuable time and money. So the Center for Employment Opportunities found that participants who responded to feedback surveys were 5 to 10% more likely to be employed 90 or 180 days after initial employment. And so this is a pretty compelling finding. Simply participating in a feedback process actually was directly related to improved employment outcomes after the program. But CEO was able to take this one step further to use this information to design with their participant advisory committee targeted outreach to work with specific participants that weren't engaging in feedback and personally reach out to see if there are ways to improve their experience. So again, in this case, feedback was part of the intervention. It's been used to strengthen outcomes, but it's also allowed them to target their programming, saving them valuable time and money in the long run. And then lastly, feedback can be used to foster more equitable programming. So taking a look at this example, this survey question came from Keystone Accountability's work in Malawi. Following a workshop with local community-based organizations, non-governmental organizations, the local Malawian government, and community structures, such as village chiefs, Keystone asked participants if, together, they had achieved a more equal way of working together. And you can see here that they have segmented the responses by organization and institution type, which allowed them to surface differences in experience. They were able to determine that community structures, such as traditional leaders, religious leaders, and community members felt that they had not yet achieved a more equal way of working together when compared to other groups like the local government. And so that, I think, is a really interesting takeaway and would allow this organization to really target, again, their programming and intervention, and to better understand how are different, in this case, organizations or institutions experiencing our programming compared to others. And again, ideally allow them to adapt their programming to improve their outcomes in the long run and foster greater equity within their work. Okay, so next I'm curious to hear from you all. Which of these arguments resonates with you in your work? And also, as you're thinking about that, you might also think about which of these arguments are ones that I could use, that I could draw on to make the case for feedback internally, either within my program or within my organization overall.
Alexis, I was thinking while people are filling it out, there was a question for you and a comment, actually. So first, Diana says, I think I have a bias about feedback. It seems that feedback is more oriented to coworkers, but not with partners or local actors. So I didn't know if you had any kind of reactions to that. And then there's a question from Sabrina that says, it seems like there is also an overlay between this and CLA. Is this overlap something you have defined or have guidance on how to incorporate as well?
Great questions, and great moment to answer those questions as well. So first, I would say the feedback we're talking about is primarily with constituents, clients, and program participants. There are great resources out there around feedback internally, but what we're focused on and really what we see our mission as is to prioritize the voices of community members, constituents, individuals participating in our programs. And what we find is the evidence tells us that by prioritizing those perspectives, by prioritizing that feedback, we can improve programmatic outcomes, foster equity, and save ourselves time and money. And then I would say, yes, I do think that feedback is a tool that could be used to foster CLA, which I believe is collaboration, learning, and adaptation. And so I would say from the collaboration perspective, I also think feedback can be used to strengthen relationships between partner organizations. I think the slide I just shared was a good example of that, asking partners, to what extent have we achieved a more equitable way of working together or of sharing power, for example. From the learning perspective, it's an opportunity to learn how program participants, constituents, clients, et cetera, are experiencing our programs. And then lastly, that course correct opportunity that we'll talk a little bit about as we get into the closed feedback loop is about adaptation. It's about making changes intentionally based on the feedback of program participants. And I would say, again, kind of going back to that slide I shared at the beginning, I do see a distinction between monitoring and evaluation and feedback, in that often when we're thinking of M&E or CLA, we're often thinking about collecting information about people, about outputs, about outcomes, and then using that internally to inform our own decision-making. What I think feedback does is it invites our constituents into that conversation to help identify what's working, what isn't working, what is driving outcomes in their lives, and then to hear what ideas they have for how we can adapt. And so it takes a lot of the guesswork out of the programs that we're developing, because we're inviting those constituents to be a part of the design and decision-making process with us. So hopefully that helps answer those two questions. And I want to take a moment to look at our poll results. So unsurprisingly, majority said all of the above. All three arguments resonate with you. And I'm thrilled to hear that. But more specifically, it looks like about a third of us really resonated with the argument related to improved programmatic outcomes. And then another third resonated with that argument around identifying whose needs aren't being met and using feedback to foster equity. So hopefully seeing a little bit of evidence and seeing some examples of the rationale for feedback in these three different ways gives you the fodder that you need to make the case for feedback internally.
Alexis, do you find whether, I mean, in your experience, one of those typically, like, do people answer one more often than not? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would say the two that were selected do tend to be the most popular. And then I would say like improved programmatic outcomes tends to be the most popular overall.
Okay.
Which I would say, like, if you've got to make the case within a mission-oriented organization, being able to demonstrate that feedback will actually lead to better outcomes than what you're currently achieving, I think is a great way to make the case for feedback internally. Thanks, Julie. And with that, I want to shift gears a little bit from kind of the rationale for feedback to this closed loop methodology that I was referencing before. So as I mentioned, at Feedback Labs, we believe that to be able to truly act on feedback effectively, you'll need to use a closed feedback loop. And so the closed feedback loop that we talk about is made up of 6 steps. And so I'll talk you through those each briefly, and then I have an example of what each of those steps looks like in practice to share with you. So the first step, which is buy-in, it's kind of hard to see, but it encompasses the entire feedback loop. And that is because it is a continuous process of identifying who are the key stakeholders that we need buy-in from, and how do we foster their interest in, their trust in the feedback process. And so during the buy-in phase, we're thinking about who are those stakeholders, whether they are the constituents or program participants themselves, maybe they are key decision makers or leadership within our organization, or even frontline staff whose perspectives are critical and who may kind of like fear a backlash from feedback. How do we identify who those folks are? And then what strategies and tactics can we use to foster buy-in with those audiences? And so I would recommend taking some intentional time at the beginning of a feedback process to think about those stakeholders and some strategies for fostering buy-in, but it's also something we're going to continue to do as we're implementing and responding to feedback. And then the first phase of the loop itself is design. And during the design phase, we're thinking about who are the specific constituents that we want feedback from. So what are their characteristics? Are they a particular segment of our population, for example? What are the contextual factors that will impact our ability to collect feedback from them? So things like language, literacy, and access to technology, religion, for example, or accessibility issues, or experience with marginalization. So identifying the contextual factors that might either create barriers or foster opportunities to give feedback. And then lastly, beginning to think about the how. So given those individuals, how can we think about structuring a feedback process? During the design phase is also when we're thinking about the what of our feedback process, meaning what do we want to collect feedback on? What are our learning goals associated with this feedback process? Are we looking to gather feedback on a particular program, on a strategic decision that we'll be making? And so having that in mind as a clear kind of North Star or guiding star for your feedback process. The next phase of the loop is collect, which is broken down into two parts. First, thinking through what is the method we plan to use to collect our feedback. Is it surveys, focus groups? Are we going to do a gallery walk at a workshop setting? Are we going to do voting with marbles and jars? There's lots of really creative feedback collection methods out there. I know our brains go straight to surveys, but there are some really awesome techniques that we can use that are creative and fun to engage our constituents. And then the second part of collect is thinking about the questions themselves. So what questions do we want to ask to achieve our learning goals? And that includes both feedback questions, but also demographic questions that will later allow us to segment our responses. And as we're thinking about the collect phase, would really encourage you as you get started to keep that collection method brief. So keeping it to 3 to 5 feedback questions, for example, so you're really focused in on gathering specific actionable feedback that you know you can and will act on. And so once we've got that data from the collect phase, that's when we move into the next step of the loop, which is analyze. During the analyze phase, we are making sense of data through segmenting by demographic data, or perhaps using cross-tabulation. So comparing responses to multiple questions to see if there are any correlations. We might be benchmarking data to see have results changed over time, or is there a difference in results across programs, for example? Or can we benchmark our results against other similar organizations? And then once we've done our initial internal analysis, that's when we take our feedback back to our constituents for a dialogue. And this is the phase of the loop that often gets missed, but I actually think is the most valuable. I feel like this is where the rubber really hits the road, where trust building and relationship building really takes place, because we're transparently sharing back the results of our initial feedback collection. And we are taking some time to verify, did we get it right? Did we understand what you meant? To ask follow-up questions, to dig deeper and clarify our understanding. And then to shift towards co-creation. So based on the feedback that we've heard so far, what ideas do you have for how we can improve? What would it look like to do things differently? And ideally, you walk away from a dialogue with practically a to-do list in hand. You have already begun to identify the course corrections, which is the final stage of your feedback loop. So during the course correct phase, we are going to identify the changes we plan to make. We're going to identify who is going to make those changes within our organization and when. And then lastly, we're going to report back to constituents on the changes that we've made based on their feedback. And so I know that was a lot of talking and a lot of theory. So let's take a look at what all of this looks like in practice. Okay, so first I want to take a look at how and why contextual design matters. So when Children International rolled out feedback loops in 13 locations around the world, their designs differed by context. In Delhi, the team surveyed constituents with low literacy levels using sticky dots and a smiley face spectrum on flip charts, keeping the surveys public and informal so parents didn't fear that their answers might impact the services that they receive. On the other hand, in the Dominican Republic, where technology access and literacy levels were higher, the team sent out surveys via mobile phones and used interactive icebreakers to facilitate focus group discussions with parents and youth. And so here's an example where the goal of the feedback process was actually the same, but the implementation and the design was entirely different based on the context in which the organizations were working. And so once we have our design, we might be thinking about collection tools. And so I wanted to share a resource that we have at Feedback Labs. Oops, did not actually mean to pull it up right here, but I can. Let me share that here, unless Julie already beat me to it. So our tools repository is really are meant to be a resource of social impact focused feedback tools. Let's get this full screen again. So I would encourage you to take some time to poke around. There's a filter functionality that allows you to filter based on language, whether you're looking to work in the US or globally. And so this could be a resource if you're looking to get started with your feedback practice, but not sure what tools to use. As I mentioned, these are all social impact focused feedback tools. These are organizations that are members of the feedback community and have designed their products with nonprofits and social impact organizations in mind. Okay, and so as we're continuing to move through the loop, also just wanted to pause to share another example of what analysis looks like in practice. So I already mentioned earlier that analysis might include a variety of different techniques, such as segmentation, cross-tabulation, and benchmarking. You might also be coding your qualitative responses or pulling out key themes and quotes to share back as part of your dialogue. And so the example I have here on the screen comes from ICANN, which is an Arizona-based youth development organization. The majority of their community identify as white or Hispanic, so they knew that looking at their aggregate data would skew their results to reflect the perspectives of that majority. As a result, they wanted to segment or disaggregate their responses to several questions by race and ethnicity to understand how race may impact how participants experience their programs. So to me, what this demonstrates is both the importance of understanding what are the key demographics that we work with, what demographic data should we be collecting as part of our feedback process, and then using the analyze stage to surface differences in experience using that demographic data. And I know we're moving rapidly along, but I do want to give you all a chance to reflect on your feedback work in just a moment. So just want to briefly highlight some examples of the next phase of the loop, which is dialogue, and what this looks like in practice. I have a few examples here because, as I mentioned, we often hear that the dialogue phase is the one that's newest to organizations that they haven't had experience using as part of feedback in the past. And so looking here at the Siegel Family Foundation, after closing an online survey process, the Siegel Family Foundation hosted 90-minute Zoom meetings with about 20 incubator participants to share feedback results, ask probing questions, and identify course corrections to improve their social impact incubator in Rwanda and Malawi. The team used a PowerPoint presentation to share graphs of quantitative results, and the team also identified key themes from open text analysis to share. The focus was on getting participants to be as specific as possible about their feedback and ideas for course correction. And as a result, the Siegel Family Foundation has revamped its learning visits, enabling incubator organizations to shadow and learn from one another. So there's an example of a dialogue that took place in 90 minutes over Zoom using PowerPoint. On the other hand, the Global Fund for Children created a youth leadership council to serve as advisors to the organization and help clarify feedback from its broader community. The organization hosts regular dialogues with its youth leadership council to inform its programs and strategy. And so here is kind of a ready-made group that this foundation is able to draw on as a source of representatives from their broader population to help interpret, make sense of, and then act on the feedback that they've received. And then lastly, I wanted to share this example from Ground Truth Solutions, which uses a community chalkboard to report back and ask follow-up questions of its broader community. So they post comments like, X% of the community feels this way, and then they ask, why do you think that might be? And so what they've done is they've actually, they've taken the concept of a dialogue, which is asking follow-up questions based on initial feedback, but they have adapted it to get broader community input using this community chalkboard concept. And so I wanted to share that example because often when we hear the word dialogue, we're thinking about a verbal exchange, but here's an instance of using a follow-up survey question as a way to facilitate dialogue. Okay, so the last example I want to share before we give you all a chance to reflect a little bit and think about how this applies to your work is an example of course correct and reporting back. So I mentioned course correct is the phase when we actually identify what changes do we plan to make and we create a plan of action to implement those changes. And we can't consider our feedback loop closed until we've actually reported back to constituents about the changes either that we have made or that we plan to make in response to the feedback that they have given us. So here's an example of reporting back using a framework that I really love. It's super simple. As you can see, it's just a 2-column table. On one hand, we have what we heard, which is different from what you said. What we heard implies that we have to some extent interpreted what you shared with us. But what they've shared here are, we heard these following key themes, and then they've shared what we will do about it. Another way to phrase this might be what we'll do, or what we have done if you've already carried out course corrections. So in this example, the organization heard that participants need access to mental health services. So they have made free counseling services available at all of their locations. And that's just one of many examples of course corrections that they planned based on the feedback that they received. Okay, so hopefully those examples gave you a little bit of a sense of what the feedback loop can look like in practice. And it's such a rapid session. I wish we had more time to go into detail, but at this point, I really want to hand it all over to you to get a sense from you all of how this, to what extent this reflects or is similar to your current feedback practice. So I have 3 quick poll questions for you. The first is, at what phase of the feedback loop do you excel? The second is, in what areas would you like to improve? And then third, based on what you learned today, what would you like to do to strengthen your organization's feedback practice? So let's hop into this first poll.
Oh, Alexis, just real quick, do you want to answer these 2 questions and then we'll go into the poll?
Why don't
or it's up to you? Do you want to wait? Do you want to wait to the end?
Yeah, I think let's go ahead and wait.
Okay.
Just to give everyone a chance to engage in these 3 quick polls. And then while the third poll is up, why don't I start answering questions just for the
Perfect. Okay.
So once again, if you want to hop back over to that same poll link, and actually it's the same poll link, so in just a moment it'll actually update, but would love to hear, in what phase of the feedback loop does your organization excel? Okay, great. Well, it looks like so far, half of us feel like we're doing well in the area of collect, which isn't actually that surprising. When we think about feedback, I think our brains go straight to the collection method. And we often find that we collect a lot of data, but we haven't necessarily always acted on the data that we did receive. But having a robust collection method in place is really critical for an effective feedback process. So excited to hear that this is an area that many of you feel like you're succeeding in, and excited to see too that a few folks feel like they're excelling in the area of buy-in, design, analyze, as well as course correct. So next, would love to ask you, in what phase of the feedback loop would you like to improve? So based on what you heard today, is there one particular phase of the feedback loop that you would like to strengthen within your organization? Okay, so it looks like so far about half of us feel like dialogue has the greatest opportunity for improvement, followed by course correct and analyze. And then several of us also feel like there's an opportunity to strengthen our work in buy-in. So identifying whose buy-in we need and what tactics and strategies we might use to secure their buy-in. Great, thanks everyone. And then this is my last poll for you all today. And that is, this is an open-ended poll. So if you head back to that same link, you should see an updated poll. Based on what you learned today, what would you like to do to strengthen your organization's feedback process? So take a moment to reflect on that question and then share one or more things that you would like to do based on today's session to strengthen your organization's feedback process. And as folks are thinking, I'm happy to start taking questions, Julie.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. We've got two so far from Diana. Sometimes we are not prepared how to give or receive feedback. What would be your recommendation to start the feedback process within a community or partner that did not have these kinds of spaces?
Great question.
Oh, do you want me to do the second one, or you just go ahead first? Oh, okay.
Let me actually answer that first, and then I'll take the next one.
Okay.
So I think that is a really great question. And when we have time to go into a lot of depth, one of the things that I especially talk about during the dialogue phase is preparing our staff to receive feedback well, because it can be really challenging to hear, especially constructive or critical feedback. Some things that we can do to prepare first are like talking through what are strategies and tips that we can use. The first is definitely to prepare ourselves not to explain away feedback. So to try to stay in the position of receiving feedback as opposed to jumping in to clarify how something is or why something is. So when we're in a dialogue setting, for example, we're not going to use that time to talk about like the history and the context of a particular decision or why a program starts at a particular time or it was held at a location, why we serve a certain food, for example. Instead, we're going to take some time to receive the feedback, and we're going to ask follow-up questions to get as much understanding, as much detail as we can about the feedback that we're receiving. We might also use our follow-up questions to shift from understanding the initial feedback to hearing what ideas that person or that group of people have to share with us about what it could look like in the future if we were to do things differently. And then we can use things like our reporting back opportunity at the end of Course Correct as our moment to clarify why things are the way they are, and to clarify if there are certain things that we're not able to change, for example. So many other tips on things you can do to set up an effective dialogue space. I think setting ground rules and thinking about ways to foster psychological safety in the environment that you're in. So we talk a lot about setting up a space to foster that psychological safety, but not necessarily telling people things like, this is a safe space or this is a brave space, because we can't guarantee that it is safe. We can't instantly command someone to be brave or vulnerable, for example. So we have a lot of tips, and I'd be happy, I can share my email address in the chat box. We'd be happy to share more ideas with you kind of outside of this session, if that would be helpful. And I know we're almost at time, actually, so I was just going to take a look at some of these poll responses, and then maybe I'll take any remaining questions that you have, Julie. But just wanted to highlight here some of the steps folks have talked about taking following today's session. So collecting anonymous feedback, promoting more inclusive feedback, improving the design, dialogue, and course correct, increasing awareness of the loop, giving feedback on a more routine basis, learning how to respond/act on feedback, setting feedback as a priority, and then remembering to regularly engage in the feedback process, socializing the dialogue and course correct stages. And then it looks like for this organization, we need to figure out how to manage getting feedback from our stakeholders, which are primarily donors who often have restrictive time constraints. And then folks often fear constructive feedback since they are embarrassed by it, take it personally, or feel it will be used by supervisors as a reason to punish them. Implement some of the tips you mentioned to take some fear out of receiving this feedback. Absolutely. And I think I very briefly mentioned that frontline staff are a huge audience that we need to foster buy-in with. And so thinking about how can we involve frontline staff throughout the design process so that we create a feedback process that they are comfortable with is one really critical way to strengthen our feedback loop. So thanks everyone for reflecting on that. Actually, I know we are just at time. just about at time. So before I take that, any remaining questions, I did just want to mention that I saw on that list there training as something folks might be interested in doing next. And just wanted to mention that that is something that Feedback Labs offers. So if you would like to strengthen your feedback process, would be happy to talk to you more about what training opportunities exist. Some other things, if you just enjoyed this session and are like, I want to engage with a community of people that are thinking about this, that also are enthusiastic about the idea of feedback, would invite you to subscribe to our newsletter or participate in one of those collaborative problem-solving sessions that I mentioned called a Lab Storm. They happen every other Thursday. They're free, and they're just a great way to hear from others that are thinking about feedback in their work. And I will put my email address in the chat. Oh, Julie has already done that, of course. So please feel free to reach out to me directly if you'd like to, if you have any follow-up questions we didn't get to today, or if you'd like to learn more about getting involved with Feedback Labs. And so with that, I will take any other questions that we have and hand it back to you, Julie.
Sure. Okay. All right. I'm just going to say the last two, and then you can take it. I think it's fine if we have another minute. So from Hannah, in scenarios where more in-person feedback may be necessary or appropriate, what are your recommendations for facilitating anonymous feedback options? So that's question one. And then from Sabrina, one challenge with asking for feedback is that there is an expectation of response, but in our projects, sometimes the ability to do what is requested or respond in the best way may be limited by project parameters, donor regulations, etc. What are ways to successfully navigate such constraints?
Great questions. So, and I was just looking back to see if I saw that first one. Okay.
You want me to,
so
I can copy and paste it.
Oh no, I see them now. I see
Got them? Okay.
So for scenarios where in-person feedback may be necessary, my guess there is that this is in scenarios where there's low literacy, for example, or limited technology access. So an anonymous survey may not be possible. For example, some things that we've seen organizations do are have surveys administered by an enumerator who is a volunteer, but still keeping the responses anonymous to the best of your ability. In instances like that, we do want to communicate upfront what are the limitations on our anonymity? How are we trying to protect the identities of individuals providing feedback, but also acknowledging that there are ways that the confidentiality of the individual giving responses may be impacted. So that's an initial thought. Some other things, there are some great technologies out there that allow you to do voice memos, which could be a really interesting approach. Memoria is one of the tools that's on the tools repository, which might be one that's interesting to check out. And with a little bit more context, we'd be happy to dig into that further with you, Hannah. So thanks for your question. And then Sabrina, you make such an excellent point that often our ability to course correct is impacted by the funding that we received. On one hand, I would argue that we should all be making the case for and building adaptation into our program designs, into our deliverables. With that said, I recognize that is challenging to do, and still, even within that setting, we are likely to be limited on what changes we can make. In this case, I would suggest setting expectations up front about what's on the table. What can we really change? And letting people know what is kind of the scope of this conversation and what environment are we operating in. You might also find that having a body in place that understands those restrictions and can still help you make sense of and act on the feedback could be useful. So that might be a really good space for a representative leadership body of some sort, an advisory committee, for example, that's made up of representatives of your broader population, and therefore can help share things like lived experience and interpret the feedback through that lens, but also can help translate feedback into help identify course corrections that are reasonable given the constraints that you're facing. So that might be one particular feedback dialogue mechanism that you want to explore, given kind of the constraints that you're up against.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alexis. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and really a special thanks to Alexis for all this like useful information. It looks like, you know, Diana was asking where to subscribe to your newsletter. So if you could please just either put in the chat or just email Alexis directly. But thank you everyone for being here. Please do not forget to fill out the survey at the end of the day. The closing plenary is next, and we'll be starting at 4 o'clock. So for those in online, we'll be live streaming that. And then for those in person, just go to the main plenary hall. And then at the end of the day, don't forget the virtual networking for those online. And then there is the reception here in person. So thank you all for joining. And thank you, Alexis. All right, bye everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.